Welcome to my presentation titled A Stranger Stared Back, Reclaiming Multiracial Indigenous Identity in the Context of US PK-20 Education. This autoethnography is a process and it comes from my dissertation work. My name is Wade Anderson and I have a decade of experience as an educator. Currently, I work as a school climate specialist at an elementary school in Portland, Oregon. In addition, I am a doctoral student at the Graduate School of Education and Counseling at Lewis and Clark College. I am Indigenous and Swedish. My father is mostly Swedish, and my indigeneity comes from my mother. She was adopted in the 1960s, but we don't know why, only that her birth mother, my grandmother, died while giving birth to her. Growing up, my mother told me that we were Italian. Our brownness needed to be explained, though I didn't know this as a child. But through genetic testing conducted by 23andMe, I confirmed my father's Swedish and Northern European ancestry, along with all of the stories he told us. But I was shocked to find that my brownness came from my indigenous ancestors, and that I had, in fact, no Italian heritage at all. This came as a shock at 31 years old, but when I thought about my brown skin and prominent nose, facial features that came from my mother, it helped to explain why the world always seemed to place me into a racial categorization that I did not recognize. This is a picture of my mom and dad on the left, obviously from quite some time ago. My wife, Corrie, and I are on the right. The picture in the middle is me, with a comparison photo of my mother pinned in the corner. Her adoptive father, my grandfather, is holding her. I wasn't planning on including this picture, and I went back and forth several times on whether or not I should. Then I realized that the reason I was going back and forth is because I felt I needed phenotypical proof that I was Indigenous, that this photo and the physical features linking my mother and her ancestors to me was needed for me to feel authentic in my claim. Seeing this picture of my mother as a baby feels like a curdling in the stomach, maybe a tingling in the spine. It's almost like seeing a ghost. And this revelation of Indigenous ancestry, especially the way it seemed to explain the quirks in my identity development as I aged, prompted me to explore what it would mean to reclaim this Indigenous portion of my multiracial identity. And this all began with a memory that shot forward like a bullet after this revelation. This first vignette is the first memory I have of encountering myself as brown in this world, and it was at an elementary school in Portland, Oregon. I had never seen something so strange and oddly haunting. It was and is an existential contortion that bent time and history, and I changed that day. A stranger stared back. I looked to my father for my self-image. He was tall, white, green eyes, ash blonde hair. He was Swedish. I thought I looked like him. My mother was short, brown skin, brown hair, and brown eyes. I looked more like her. I didn't know it. In third grade, I was below grade level in reading. There was a meeting before school. I remember my mother being upset. My teacher was in her car reading a newspaper. When we met in the library with two other adults, my teacher came in late saying, "I didn't know I was invited." Afterward, my mother was saying, "And she was in the car reading a newspaper." I was taken from my classroom and led into another room, a smaller room, a cramped and stuffy room. I saw 6 other students sitting in a circle around a tattered rug. As I looked at each of them, I saw that they were black and brown. As I looked around, I caught my reflection in a computer monitor tucked away in the corner of the room. It was such a finite moment in time. Now it feels like a flash of light, or maybe a tear, perhaps something on the margins speaking back, whatever it was, or is. When I saw my reflection in that computer monitor, A stranger stared back, heart-stopping. I didn't look like my dad. I looked different. Strange in a way that required my mind to twist and turn in order to make sense of what I was seeing. I was more like these other children. But in this room, in this place, that did not feel like a good thing. This room was stuffy, suffocating, and sad. The teacher spoke as if she was sorry that we all had to be there. I felt small. I wanted to fold in on myself. Whatever this room was, or what it meant, I wanted to get away, as far away as I could. What I didn't realize at the time is that I wasn't alone. The number of people in the US that identify as multiracial and indigenous has exploded since 1960, going from 550,000 in that year to almost 11.5 million in 2020. And this increase is not by exponential birth rate among the indigenous population, but by those choosing to identify as indigenous who had not previously. This identity reclamation is a fraught prospect. Settler colonialism has done its work and is doing its work to erase and replace an identity originally linked to land and culture with a convoluted mix of legislated racial categorization, internalized racism, forced removal and separation, including a robust transracial adoption program and an education for extinction. Those of us who choose to explore the reclamation of the stolen identity work through a thick fog of confusion, self-doubt, and an unavoidable dilemma of whether or not it's worth it. Why bother when I've had the benefit of being raised by a white father, been provided the social capital needed to navigate white America, and have been fortunate enough to find myself in a position where I have consistent employment and a home? The only time that I feel like it is worth it is when I listen to the stories of others like me. And here are just a couple of examples of the voices I first heard in my research for how we can reclaim this identity living as a product of transracial adoption, erasure, and assimilation. Sarah Cardinal interviewed Indigenous transracial adoptees in Canada, and one participant said, "There was nobody to give me insight on who I was and why my sisters and I were brown." Exactly the story that I grew up with. In Children of the Dragonfly, a group of Indigenous folks discussed the fraught nature of expressing Indigenous identity in this same context, saying, "Here I am, erased. I mean, I don't show up on any tribal roles. I don't know what tribe I am. I don't know who my people are. I don't know anything. They succeeded in erasing me as an Indian person." Natalie St. Denis describes the haunting of her Indigenous identity when she writes, "I was shocked by my reflection. An Indigenous woman was staring back at me. Although nothing in my external world had changed, something within me was stirring and awakening." However, a week later, the Indigenous woman in the mirror had disappeared. It took another 12 years for her to reappear, to take a stand and challenge my identity. And these are just a few of the examples of Indigenous folks reckoning with a kind of haunting, a gnawing at the margins, a kind of world-shattering unfolding, revealing a glimmer, a light shining through a dark fog. And when I read these stories, hear these voices, reclaiming my identity feels like a responsibility, like my ancestors are watching and waiting for me to look back so that they might push me forward. One of the strangely poignant readings I found while conducting research for this project was when I was first being introduced to autoethnography as a legitimate form of qualitative research. And this was a beautiful revelation in and of itself. But another unexpected turn occurred while I was reading in the Handbook of Autoethnography, A Glossary of a Haunting by Eve Tuck and C. Ree. And I wrote this after reading that work. Ancestral hauntings. The haunting of my phenotype, the way I chased whiteness but remained other and small and arbitrary ways, in ways that conjure the idea of the little things, Not a big deal, but many little things in aggregate make up a life. The prodding of a dogmatically racial America conjured ghosts of my Indigenous past that refused to be ignored until they began to manifest in my consciousness. These hauntings are the ghosts of my ancestors, whom I do not know, whom I may never know, and yet they might just guide me forward. I hope it's not just me. It's the fear of being alone, the sadness with not belonging, the slow realization that for some God-forsaken reason, it means something to spend time with people who look like me and think in a way that resonates with something deep inside of me. Living undercover amidst a sea of whiteness, and Portland is white as fuck, even to me. Ultimately, this process began with a revelation of my Indigenous heritage and an explanation of why I faced the racial categorization that I did growing up. And immediately it seemed like I must reclaim this identity. But the more I work with it and sit with it, the more I work my job and make a living, the more I ask, is it worth it? Why bother? And the answer to that question that I have right now is it becomes worth it when I listen to the stories of others who have had the exact same experience as me, very similar, or when I stop for more than a moment to ponder what my ancestry means, or when I look at pictures of myself and my family from years ago and strangers stare back. Thank you for listening. Please reach out if you have questions or suggestions or anything to contribute. I'd love to hear from you. It was good to meet you. Thanks.